Hello and welcome back to Introduction to Sociology Part 2. In today's lesson, we will be looking at and trying to understand the concept of Dalit feminism, how it evolved, its journey, and where it stands today. Now, without further ado, let's begin. While trying to understand the concept of Dalit feminism, what is very important is to understand how feminism started in the first place. So, we will try and understand about the four waves of feminism as briefly as possible. The first wave of feminism started with the movement of the suffragettes. That is, it started with women trying to get equal rights to vote. The first wave existed in the late 19th century to the early part of the 20th century, and it officially began with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, where women from various sections of society met and tried to fight for their equal rights, particularly the right to vote. The second wave of feminism began in the 60s and extended and lasted well into the 80s and even the 90s. Now, this phase or this wave of feminism in the 60s actually originated in the United States. And it was all about understanding what women needed beyond voting rights, beyond the right to property. Therefore, this second wave was motivated and fueled by anti-war sentiments, by civil rights movements that existed at that point of time, and by the concept of what people of the minority communities and people of color needed. So, the anti-war and civil rights movements lent quite a bit of support to the second wave of feminism. Apart from this, a very important aspect of the second wave of feminism was sexual rights of women and the reproductive rights of women. Sexuality and reproductive rights really made their way into the second wave of feminism and resulted in the passing of the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution, guaranteeing social equality regardless of sex. Broader critiques based on patriarchy, based on heteronormative equations, based on capitalism also existed. The woman's role was seen as being confined either as the wife or the mother, which was the point where the problem lied. Essentially, it was all about looking at women's roles beyond their roles at home and beyond their roles dependent upon others. Sex and gender were differentiated, with sex being a biological term which was concerned predominantly with the human anatomy, and gender was differentiated as being a term that basically spoke about the socialization process of each individual. Gender existed as a result of a person's experiences and socializations towards the world. Books like Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, released in 1963, and Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, released in the United States in 1953, together with the concept of identity politics, really helped to demonstrate that race, class, and gender oppression are all related to one another. The third wave of feminism started in the 90s. And what happened in the third wave was it looked at women's roles beyond their sexuality, beyond the concept of beauty. And the third wave really questioned the concept of beauty as well and embraced it. Many constructs were destabilized, including the notions of universal womanhood, body, gender, sexuality, and heteronormativity. Aspects and tools of beauty that were earlier rejected and discarded by the second wave feminists were, to many people's surprise, actually adopted and embraced by the third wave feminists. Movements like #MeToo and the Time's Up campaign do tell us that we might just be in the middle of the fourth wave of feminism today. Intersectionality, understanding women's suppression, that it is related to other issues of class, caste, race, religion, intersectionality is one of the predominant elements that are necessary in understanding how fourth wave feminism functions today. Feminism is part of a larger consciousness of oppression, along with racism, ageism, classism, ableism, and sexual orientation. Now, feminism, understanding how it works in India, will automatically involve going to the first wave of feminists in India and understanding how they functioned. First wave feminists in India were essentially women related to the reformers or the nationalists. Many upper caste women, mainly upper caste women, who lobbied tirelessly for the right to property and amendments in the Hindu law of marriage. The second wave feminists in India after that formed autonomous groups and highlighted the issue of violence against women, both inside and outside the home. Free legal aid centers were established, street plays were conducted, and posters were circulated to raise awareness among women regarding issues of violence, regarding issues of domestic abuse, and regarding issues of sexual violence. The laws against Rape and Dowry Prohibition Act were amended. While feminists around the world, white feminists in particular, their discourse on third world women constantly projected women of color and women in third world countries as being the perennial victim. They constantly thought that women in these countries were always and were already victims. The experiences and trials of women are nuanced and affected by multiple issues. That is what is important to understand when it comes to the context of feminism in countries like India. Understanding the concept of violence and how it starts, sex-based violence, religion-based violence, caste-based violence, and how it affects people across the board. In the upper caste communities, women do face violence within the sanctum sanctorum of their homes, within their personal spaces. They face control and violence within their families. Lower caste women, while not having to face similar levels of violence within their families, however, because of the lack of these controls in their personal spaces, lower caste women are left vulnerable to threats of rape, sexual assault, and abuse in public spaces. Some of these are even accepted as given, and some practices like Sati and Devdasi practice were even glorified. So, the reality of women in Indian society remains to be seen, and we need to understand the reality of women in our society down the ages. From the late 18th century, the missionaries had constantly attacked a range of degenerate Hindu practices, or what they considered to be degenerate. One of those practices was definitely sati. And by highlighting some of these practices, the intention of missionaries was obviously to highlight how Hinduism backed men and backed violence propagated by men in certain spaces, vis-a-vis Christianity, which, according to them, was a religion which did not promote any similar practices. Now, debates were all based on the upper caste religious texts and forms of violence being addressed. The lower caste women were being marginalized by the new land legislation, and they were exposed to threats of sexual assault and sexual violence under the zamindari system. And the zamindari system of land legislation led to a lot of problems in society, not only in terms of the financial aspect, but also in terms of the social aspect, looking at how the upper caste people, both men and women, subjected people from the lower castes to violence, to insults regularly as a result of existing legislation which supported them. Now, this spirituality of the inner sanctum, the home, was to be maintained by the woman, and the woman was constantly looked at as being the torch bearer of tradition. By reverse logic, all those women who did not uphold tradition were looked at as being impure. They were labeled as being impure. The debate on widow burning or sati began in the 1780s when the missionaries first took up the issue. The colonial administration first intervened in the civil society on the issue of sati. The women's movement in India has been in a lull after the declaration of independence and the granting of constitutional guarantees of equality and freedom for all. So, the first 30 years after independence, women figured in the planned development only in the capacities of mothers or under the mother and child welfare programs, despite the fact that more than 50% of the agricultural labor was provided by women. They were not accepted, they were not recognized in terms of people who could contribute positively to the economy of a growing, newly independent nation like India. The number of dowry deaths and malnutrition of women have shown a steady increase over the years. In the industrial sector, in the free trading zones, women have been exploited as cheap labor and have been made to work under conditions of strict supervision and physical abuse. International organizations such as the International Planned Parenthood Federation or the IPPF and the Population Council have promoted the use of hormonal implants and injectables. 80% of India's population lives in rural areas and more than 70% of India's female labor force exist without having basic rights. Food allocation in the family is heavily biased in favor of men even today. As a result, because of not receiving proper nutrition, the mortality rate among women continues to be higher. Within the upper castes, it is a struggle against seclusion and torture within the family. The population of women in India has been declining and the sex ratio has declined from 972 females to 1,000 males in 1901 to 927 females to 1,000 men in 1991. The ratio remains a constant change in the curve over the years. Only 24.8% of the women are literate and only 5.7% can ever reach university. Although governments do continue to roll out schemes which will promote the education of women and girls, however, in personal spaces, that is yet to be seen. The birth of daughters continues to be unwelcome in quite a few places in the country, and new forms of female feticide continue to happen. The birth of a daughter is looked at as a liability because of issues like guarding her virginity and the financial concerns of paying debts because dowry has to be paid at the time of her marriage. After independence, there had been 38 cases of widow burning in India, which caused the country to be delved into a situation of public outcry. The ultimate resolution of the management and control over widows' sexuality was this practice of sati. The concept of the social and sexual freedom of a widow was so threatening at that point of time to the upper castes that it was considered to be an easier, a more convenient option to have a widow dying along with her dead husband. In upper caste homes, everyday methods of control continue to exist in the form of linguistic cues, verbal abuse, and stereotype enforcing rules. Women's labor continues to be seen as something that is taken for granted. On the other hand, in fact, it is glorified by giving it terms like Grihalakshmi. Household chores are all forced upon women, and women are taken for granted as being the only person in the household in charge of completing these tasks. The denial of the right to work outside the home. Even today, women of upper castes are not allowed to work outside the home for various reasons. Private patriarchal authority uses ideology which highlights women's total commitment to the needs of the household and, on the other hand, consistently reiterates taboos against sexuality or reproduction outside family and caste mores. So, while upper caste women face various restrictions in their personal space and in their homes that do not allow them to go to work or do not allow them to go about their lives in a certain way, in the case of lower caste women, their labor outside the family is crucial to the survival, to the financial survival of that family. This leads to a lack of stringent controls on their mobility and their sexuality. However, as a result, this also renders them impure or lacking in virtue. Hence, this leaves them vulnerable towards the threat of rape, gender-based violence, and physical violence in public spaces. Dalit women suffer rape as part of the ongoing caste confrontations. There are, however, a few cases of violence which we will try and understand in terms of the Mathura rape case, where an incident of custodial rape in India in 1972 happened in Mathura, where a young tribal girl was allegedly raped by policemen in custody in a police station. After the Supreme Court acquitted the accused, there was a public outcry and protest which eventually led to amendments in the Indian rape law via the Criminal Law Amendment Act 1983, which highlighted the problems and the dangers of custodial death. In the Chunduru carnage, 13 Dalit people were killed by upper caste men in Chunduru in 1991. At Pimpri Deshmukh in Maharashtra, following the hacking to death of a Dalit kotwal by upper caste men, the upper caste women came out in public complaining that people from the Dalit community had harassed them and some of them were sexually perverted. The Bhavri Devi case continues to be one of the most important and one of the most recalled cases of gender-based violence, sexual violence and caste-based violence in the country. In 1992, Bhavri Devi and her husband were working in the fields in Bhatteri village in Rajasthan when they were attacked by a group of upper caste men. After they attacked the husband, Bhavri Devi was then gang raped by these men. It was her case that resulted in the Indian Supreme Court formulating guidelines to deal with sexual harassment in the workplace and strong guidelines which tried to provide a stop or at least try to make people understand the dangers and the problems associated with gender-based and caste-based violence. Now, when we also look at understanding Dalit feminism and understanding the issue of caste in our country, we cannot ignore the contributions of two people. One is Jyotiba Phule and the other is B.R. Ambedkar. Jyotiba Phule's project for the liberation of the Shudras and anti-Shudras and women from the slavery of Brahmanism, he conceptualized a Bali Rajya of equality of all men in opposition to Ram Rajya based on Vara Ashram Dharma, thus reversing the Aryan theory and giving a liberatory vision of history. The first political play was Tritiya Ratna. Jewel as a metaphor for the third eye was presented. He also wanted to help and did help Bahujan women fight against double patriarchy both within their homes and in external spaces, and he opened the first school for low caste girls in 1848 in Pune. His wife Savitribai Phule devoted her life to working for women's education and against caste practices. Muktabai, who was a student of Phule, in an essay entitled About the Girls of Mangs and Mahars, draws attention to the deprivation of lower castes. Tarabai Shinde's Stri Purush Tulana, a text in 1882, was against women's subordination and was written from within the Satya Shodhak tradition. This text launched an attack not only on Brahmanical patriarchy, but also the patriarchies among the Kunbi and other non-Brahmin castes. Ambedkar had a practice of organizing women's conferences along with every general meeting. In these parishads of the 1930s, Dalit women delegates passed resolutions against child marriage, enforced widowhood and dowry, critiquing these practices as Brahmanical and caste-based. Women's participation in the Mahad Satyagraha, their support to the Independent Labour Party and the Scheduled Caste Federation were some of the instances that helped to take the cause of Dalit feminism forward. Ambedkar argued that practices of sati, enforced widowhood and child marriage, come to be prescribed by Brahmanism in order to regulate and control any transgression of boundaries. That is to say, he underlines the fact that the caste system can be maintained only through the control on women's sexuality, and in this sense, women are the gateways to the caste system. It is important for us to understand that the caste system relies heavily on the concept of endogamy and tries to stop the practices of exogamy, which is marrying outside one's caste or at least outside one's subcaste. Now we come to understand why Dalit feminism was left out of the public space or didn't quite manage to garner the attention that it should have in the 70s, 80s and 90s. We'll try and understand the masculinization of Dalithood and the Savarnization of womanhood. In the 1970s and early 80s, Shramik Mukti Sangathan, Satya Shodhak Communist Party, Shram Mukti Dal and Yuvak Kranti Dal, all of these were set up in order to help women from lower castes. All of them accorded Dalit women a central place in the public discourse. While for Dalit men, caste was contained in class, for Savarna women, the notion of sisterhood was foremost. All women came to be conceived as victims and therefore Dalit. So that what results is a classist exclusion. All Dalits are assumed to be males and all women Savarna. Hence, there wasn't enough of a space given to understanding women who were Dalit. As a result, this also was involved in a lack of understanding, a lack of a larger understanding in the public space regarding the issues which plague women from lower castes. We also have to understand a non-Brahmanical rendering of women's liberation. In the 90s, the formation of the National Federation of Dalit Women and the All India Dalit Women's Forum, Maharashtra Dalit Mahila Sangathan in 95 and the Bahujan Mahila Parishad. All of these groups, all of these bodies were formed in order to forward the cause and help women from the Dalit background and from lower caste backgrounds to break the shackles of oppression in society and move forward. There are three major contesting and overlapping positions that have emerged from the struggles and politics of Dalit women. The Marxist Phule Ambedkarite position of the Satya Shodhak Mahila Sabha, the Dalit Bahujan Alliance is that of the Bahujan Mahila Mahasangh BMM, and this critiques the Vedic Brahmanical tradition and seeks to revive the Bahujan tradition of the Adi Maya. The Dalit Mahila Sangathan has critiqued the persistence of the Manuvadi Sanskriti. A Dalit feminist standpoint is seen as being emancipatory, since the subject of its knowledge is embodied and visible. This position argues that it is more emancipatory than other existing positions and counters pluralism and relativism. Hence, one must educate themselves about the history of these movements, the preferred social relations and utopias and the struggles of the marginalized. Apart from understanding the conversations around Dalit feminism and caste-based violence in the public space, we can also look back at various films in mainstream media and try and see how Dalit women, women from marginalized sections of society, and caste and gender-based violence have been portrayed there. Starting with films like Nishant by Shyam Benegal, Mirch Masala by Ketan Mehta, where we can see various women from the lower castes being objectified and being subjected to violence, gender-based violence and sex-based violence, where they are forced to do favors to upper caste men, where they are raped, and where they are exposed to a certain derogatory existence day in and day out. The story of Bandit Queen Phulan Devi, where she was gang raped at a very early age, and that resulted in her transformation later on, which was filled with a story of vengeance. And finally, Article 15, which looks at the gang rape and murder of two girls from the lower castes and tries and understands why such kind of violence exists even today by looking at the point of view of people in society, because of which women continue to be subject to gender-based violence and caste-based violence today. Let's hope that all that changes in the near future, and as we educate ourselves with the history of the community and the women who have faced so much but have risen above and beyond all these trials and tribulations that exist in society.